He hadn't planned on saving anyone that day, but then a little girl clutched the orphanage fence and asked, "Just for today, please pretend to be my daddy." That's all she wanted. Elias Mercer hadn't said yes to much of anything since his wife died, but when he saw the fear in her eyes, he stepped across that fence and into a fight he didn't see coming, because protecting her meant standing against the kind of men who didn't take no for an answer. If you believe one small promise can change two broken lives, stay with us. Elias Mercer moved through his days like a man following orders he didn't remember giving himself. Every morning he rose before the sun, not because he wanted to, not because there was much to do, but because waking up felt better than lying in bed staring at the ceiling, waiting for nothing. The house was too quiet now. The chair by the fireplace stayed empty. The kitchen shelves held more dust than food, and the clock on the mantel hadn't been wound in months. Elias didn't notice small things anymore. Not the crack in the floorboards near the door, not the way his shirts hung loose where they used to fit snug across his shoulders, not even the ache in his knees when he stood too fast. Most days he drove the mule cart into town for no real reason at all. He'd park near the general store, step down from the wagon, and linger by the hitching post like he was waiting for someone. Of course, no one ever came. The truth was, Elias wasn't waiting for anyone. He just didn't know where else to stand. The list in his pocket was fake, a scrap of paper with nothing written on it, a prop to make it look like he had errands, like he had a life. Inside the store, he'd wander between shelves, staring at sacks of flour, tins of coffee, boxes of nails, and bars of soap. The clerk would nod at him, cautious but polite. Folks around here had learned to leave him alone. A man like Elias, one who'd buried his wife and never spoke much after, earned a kind of quiet distance. He'd buy something small just to justify the trip. A spool of thread, a single candle. Once, just a handful of nails he didn't need. Then he'd step back outside, adjust his hat out of habit, and turn toward his wagon. That's where he was, halfway between the store and his mule, when he heard it. "Sir." The voice stopped him cold. Not loud, not urgent, just enough to make him pause. His first thought was that he imagined it. Second thought, somebody was talking to someone else. Third thought, he should keep walking. But something about the way that one word, "sir," fell out into the air made him turn. No one stood near the wagon. No one on the boardwalk. Then he heard it again, softer this time, but clear. "Sir, down here." Elias lowered his gaze, eyes falling toward the orphanage fence across the street. And there she was, a little girl. Couldn't have been more than 7. Skinny as a rail. Her dress hung wrong on her frame like it had been sewn for someone twice her size. Her hands gripped the peeling white fence so tight her knuckles turned pale. And her eyes weren't soft, weren't playful, weren't anything like what a child's eyes should be. They looked like they belonged to someone much older, someone tired. For a long second, neither of them moved. She didn't blink. He didn't breathe. Then, slowly, Elias took one step toward her and waited. Elias stopped a few feet from the fence, close enough to see the dirt smudged across the girl's cheeks and the frayed edges of her sleeves. She didn't flinch when he stepped closer, didn't back away. She just held her ground like someone who'd already been through worse and decided fear was a waste of time. Elias cleared his throat. The sound felt foreign in his chest. "You, need something?" Her fingers tightened on the fence rail. For a second, she seemed to lose her nerve. Her mouth opened, then closed again. He was about to turn away when she finally spoke. "Could you pretend to be my daddy?" The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Elias blinked. "I'm sorry." "What?" Her gaze dropped to her shoes. "Just for today," she whispered. "Just for one day." Behind her, the orphanage door stood half open. From inside, he could hear voices, sharp, impatient. The kind of voices that made a child shrink smaller without anyone laying a hand on her. Miss Ada Penrose's figure moved in the shadows of the doorway, strict, thin-lipped, with that tired air of someone who had more children than resources and no patience left for either. Elias shifted on his feet, unsure what to say. "Why?" he asked, keeping his tone low. The girl swallowed hard before answering. "They're coming to take us," she said. "The ones who came last week, the man with the gold ring. He picks the ones with strong arms and clear skin. Says the sick ones go somewhere else. Her voice cracked on that last word. Else. Elias felt a slow, cold knot form in his stomach. He didn't know much about how the orphanage worked. Didn't want to. Folks around town whispered now and then about kids disappearing, about buyers from out of state coming through with too many questions and not enough answers. But hearing it from her, seeing the way her hands shook even as she tried to hide it, that did something to him. He rubbed the back of his neck, glancing around as if expecting someone else to step in. No one did. She lifted her chin, looking him square in the eye. "They won't take me if I have a father," she said, voice steady now. "That's the rule." Elias opened his mouth to argue but stopped, because deep down he knew. Today wasn't going to be about rules. Today was about a little girl who'd decided that a stranger was safer than the future waiting for her on the other side of that door. "All right," he said finally, the word tasting strange on his tongue. "Just for today." Her shoulders dropped with relief, but she didn't smile. She didn't run to him. She just gave a small nod, like a soldier acknowledging orders received. And with that, Elias Mercer, who hadn't cared about much of anything in years, stepped across the fence line and into something he didn't understand yet, but knew he couldn't walk away from. The first thing Elias did was offer her his hand. Not because he knew what else to do, but because it felt like the right thing. Her palm was small, bony, and cold. She hesitated before taking it, like she wasn't used to reaching for anyone. They walked across the street together, past the blacksmith shop, past the general store, past the people who paused mid-conversation to watch. Elias didn't miss the stairs. Old Widow Harper tilted her head in confusion. Mr. Bledsoe from the feed store narrowed his eyes, already storing this scene away for later gossip. Even the sheriff, Grant Holloway, standing on the boardwalk with his coffee, gave Elias a long, questioning look. Elias didn't meet anyone's gaze. He just kept walking. When they reached the wagon, he helped her up without a word, hitched the mule, climbed onto the bench beside her, and drove home like he'd done 100 times before, except this time, he wasn't alone. She sat with her hands folded tight in her lap, staring straight ahead like a passenger on a train with no idea where it was going. Halfway to the cabin, Elias cleared his throat. "What's your name?" "Clara," she said, soft but steady. "Clara what?" Her shoulders lifted in a tiny shrug. "Just Clara." Elias nodded like that was answer enough. When they got to the house, she stepped down from the wagon before he could offer help, waited at the porch while he unhitched the mule, followed him inside like a shadow. The cabin smelled like wood smoke and old memories. The table held one chair now. He'd never bothered pulling out the second since Evelyn died. Elias hesitated, then dragged the other chair from the corner and set it across from his. He didn't say anything about it. Neither did she. By habit, he lit the stove and put water on to boil. The pantry shelves were nearly bare, but he managed to find oats and a half-empty jar of honey. He handed her a bowl, and for the first time all morning she let go of that tight grip she'd been holding in her hands. They ate in silence. Afterward, Clara drifted to the hearth, sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring at the cold ashes like she could read something inside them. Elias busied himself with meaningless tasks, checking the door latch, folding the same blanket twice, adjusting the curtain that didn't need adjusting. But his eyes kept drifting back to her. That afternoon, while splitting wood, he caught movement at the edge of the property line. 2 men standing just far enough away to pretend they weren't watching. One wore a brown coat with a torn sleeve. The other leaned against a tree like he had all the time in the world. Elias's stomach twisted. They weren't from town, and they weren't here by accident. Clara must have sensed something too. She stood at the window, fingers pressed to the glass, her face pale but unreadable. Elias wiped the sweat from his brow, tightened his grip on the axe handle, and stared back at the men until they turned and disappeared into the trees. For the first time in 3 years, Elias felt something close to fear. Not for himself, for her. That night, Elias barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan from the rafters, every shift in the wind set his nerves on edge. Clara slept curled on the floor near the hearth, wrapped in the old quilt Evelyn had sewn years ago. Her breathing stayed soft, steady, like she'd learned long ago how to sleep light and ready to run. Elias sat in his chair, shotgun across his lap, staring at the door. By dawn, he convinced himself it had been nothing, just two wanderers passing through. Coincidence. But by noon that lie broke apart. He heard the hoofbeats first. Slow, measured. One horse, one rider. Elias stepped onto the porch, shotgun still in hand. The man who rode up looked like trouble dressed in Sunday clothes. Black coat, dust-streaked trousers, a gold ring that caught the light when he tugged off his gloves. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Morning," the stranger said, voice smooth as creek water but twice as cold. Elias didn't answer. The man nodded toward the house. "Name's Silas Crowley. Heard you might have something that belongs to me." Elias stayed quiet. The air between them stretched thin. Silas dismounted slow, taking time to brush dust off his lapel. "See, there's a little girl," he said, smiling like this was casual conversation. "Name's Clara. She's on a list. My list. Came all this way to collect her proper." Inside the house, Elias heard a faint shuffle. Clara had moved to the corner near the window, crouching low, watching. Silas caught the glance. "She's a runner, that one," he said, shaking his head like it was a joke they both understood. "Spirited. I like spirit. Makes the others easier to handle when they see what happens to the stubborn ones." Elias's grip tightened on the shotgun. "I don't know what business you think you've got here," he said, voice low, "but this is my land, and she's under my roof." Silas's smile thinned. For now. A beat of silence passed. Then Silas stepped back toward his horse, slow and easy. "No sense making this harder than it needs to be," he said, mounting up. "I'll give you till sundown tomorrow. After that, we settle this another way." Without waiting for a reply, he pulled on the reins and rode off, dust rising behind him like a curtain closing on a bad play. Elias stood there for a long moment, shotgun still raised, heart pounding harder than it had in years. Behind him, Clara stepped into the doorway, her face pale but steady. Her voice came small but sure. "I told you. They were coming." Elias lowered the shotgun, looked at her, and in that quiet second between breath and decision, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't letting her go. By the time the sun dropped low behind the ridge, Elias had dragged every spare board, chain, and nail he owned into the yard. The front door got an extra beam across it. The windows, what few there were, got shuttered tight with planks pulled from the old tool shed. The barn doors were bolted. Even the chicken coop got reinforced, though there hadn't been chickens in it for over a year. Clara stayed close, moving from room to room like a small, silent shadow. She didn't ask questions, didn't cry, didn't say a word about what tomorrow might bring. When Elias paused to catch his breath, she handed him a hammer without being asked. By nightfall, the cabin looked less like a home and more like a place waiting for war. Still, Elias knew it wouldn't be enough, not alone. Before first light, he hitched the mule and rode into town. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that made a man wonder how many folks had already heard what was coming and decided to keep their heads low. He went first to the jailhouse. Sheriff Grant Holloway stood out front, arms crossed, leaning against the doorframe like he'd been expecting him. His badge hung crooked on his vest, like it didn't weigh enough to sit right. Elias climbed down from the wagon, eyes level. "I've got trouble," he said, voice flat. The sheriff didn't blink. "Crowley?" Elias nodded. Holloway scratched at the back of his neck, letting out a long, tired breath. "Figured he'd show up sooner or later," the sheriff muttered. "Never liked that man. Never liked his business either." Elias stepped closer. "I'm not asking for favors," he said. "But if he comes to take her, I won't let it happen, you understand me?" The sheriff's gaze stayed steady. "I understand." He pushed off the doorframe. "Give me an hour. I'll come up." Next stop was the church. Reverend Amos Thatcher answered the door still in his nightshirt, looking like he hadn't slept more than a handful of hours all week. His face carried the weight of too many sermons preached to people who didn't want saving. When Elias explained, the preacher didn't hesitate. "I've done worse things for worse reasons," Amos said quietly. "I'll bring rope and kerosene, in case this turns biblical." Last, Elias went to see Tom Larkin, once a deputy, now just another man trying to drink away a ruined reputation. Elias found him outside the livery, sitting on an overturned bucket with a bottle dangling from his fingers. I need you sober, Elias said. Tom looked up, eyes red and dull. For what? For the girl. Tom stared at him for a long second, then dragged his sleeve across his mouth, stood up slow and tossed the bottle into the dirt. All right, he said, voice rough. For the girl. By midday, the three of them rode toward the cabin. Elias led the way, heart pounding, shotgun resting across his knees. Behind him came a preacher with a lantern, a disgraced deputy with a rifle, and a sheriff who hadn't picked a side in years, but just did. Lines had been drawn, and by sundown, Elias knew they'd all be tested for it. By the time the first shot rang out, the air inside the cabin was thick with the smell of oil, sweat, and splintered wood. Elias had stationed Clara deep in the root cellar, behind 2 crates of preserved peaches and a rusted milk pail. He made her promise not to come out. Not for noise, not for yelling, not even for him. She didn't argue, just wrapped her arms around her knees and nodded, her face pale but steady. Upstairs, Elias and the others waited. Tom Larkin sat near the east window with the rifle balanced on his knee, loading rounds slow and careful, like a man trying to atone for something he couldn't name. Reverend Thatcher crouched by the door with the lantern and a length of rope coiled beside him, whispering whatever prayers came to mind, half to God, half to himself. Sheriff Holloway stood at the back wall, shotgun in hand, jaw clenched like he'd already counted how many mistakes in his life had led to this moment. Outside, hoofbeats circled the house. Silas Crowley had come back with more men this time. 6, maybe 7. Voices shouted from the tree line. Boots crunched over the dry dirt. Mercer, Crowley's voice rang out, slick and venomous. Last chance, send her out and we leave this place standing. Elias stepped to the door, heart hammering in his chest. You set foot on this land again, Silas. You won't leave standing at all. A beat of silence. Then, gunfire. The first bullet shattered the front window. Glass rained down across the table. Tom fired back, dropping one of the shadowy figures near the woodpile. Reverend Thatcher pulled Elias down just as a second round split the air inches above his head. Stay low, the preacher barked, voice hoarse. The walls shook as Crowley's men began pushing toward the porch. 2 climbed onto the roof, their boots scraping against the shingles. Elias grabbed the shotgun, kicked open the back door, and fired twice, sending both men tumbling off the roof into the dirt below. Smoke filled the cabin. The smell of gunpowder burned Elias's throat. Tom cursed from his position near the window, ducking as another volley of shots tore through the shutters. We're not gonna hold like this, he shouted. Elias wiped blood from a cut on his forehead, breathing hard. We hold as long as it takes. A pause, then more shouting from outside. Through the haze, Elias spotted Silas himself, stepping forward, cocky and sure, raising his pistol. The shot that followed wasn't from Crowley's gun. It came from Elias. A single pull of the trigger. Silas staggered back 2 steps, looking down at the spreading stain across his chest like he didn't quite believe it. Then he dropped. Flat. Still. The gunfire stopped. The other men froze, then scattered, running for their horses, disappearing into the trees without another word. For a long minute, no one inside the cabin moved. Then, slowly, Elias lowered the shotgun, chest heaving, legs shaking beneath him. Down in the cellar, Clara stayed silent. But when Elias opened the door and climbed down to her, she looked at him like she already knew. The man who had once been a stranger had just killed for her. By the time morning light broke over the ridge, the yard was quiet again. Crows circled above the tree line, picking at the ground where Silas Crowley's body had lain before the sheriff, and Tom dragged it behind the barn. No one said much. Sheriff Holloway stayed just long enough to help bury the worst of the mess. Then he dusted off his hands, gave Elias a long, steady look, and rode back to town without asking for explanations. The Reverend left next. Said he had a sermon to write, though Elias doubted the man would speak a word of what happened here to anyone. Tom Larkin lingered a little longer. He sat on the porch steps, running his fingers along the barrel of his rifle like he didn't quite know how to put it down. When he finally stood, he slapped Elias on the shoulder with something close to respect. "Be seeing you," was all he said before heading out. Elias spent the rest of the morning boarding up the windows again, patching bullet holes and gathering what little food remained. Clara stayed close. She followed him from room to room, never more than a few steps behind. Every time the floor creaked, her eyes darted to the door. Every time the wind shifted, she tensed like expecting more gunfire. By midday, Elias hitched the mule and loaded her into the wagon. "We're going to town," he said simply. She didn't ask why. At the sheriff's office, Holloway waited behind his desk, thumbing through a stack of papers that looked more like obligations than law. When Elias stepped inside with Clara at his side, the sheriff didn't look up right away. Finally, Holloway spoke, voice low. "You know how many laws you just broke?" Elias didn't answer. Holloway set the papers aside, let out a slow sigh, and stood. "Truth is, folks around here don't like men like Crowley. They won't mourn him, and they sure won't ask why he never made it back across the county line." He crossed the room, opened a drawer, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Guardianship petition," the sheriff said, holding it out. "It's not adoption. Not yet. But it's a start." Elias stared at the form. His throat tightened. "I don't have money for court fees," he said. Holloway shrugged. "Seems to me the paperwork got filed last week. Fee paid in full. Judge signed off this morning." Elias blinked. "By who?" The sheriff just smiled. "Must have been some mistake in the records." Clara stayed quiet at Elias's side, but he felt her small hand slip into his. Holloway handed over the paper and turned back to his desk, already pretending the conversation never happened. Elias folded the document with slow, careful fingers, slipped it into his coat pocket like something fragile that might break if handled wrong. On the way out, Clara tugged on his sleeve. "Does this mean—" she started, voice catching. Elias looked down at her, his voice steady for the first time in days. "It means you're staying." And for the first time, she smiled. The years that followed reshaped everything. What had started as one man and one scared little girl became something larger, something unexpected. Elias didn't set out to build anything permanent. Not at first, but life had a way of growing where grief once lived. It began with one more child, a boy named Henry, left behind after a wagon accident on the outskirts of town. Then came Ruthie, who'd run barefoot from a neighbor's farm one frostbitten night, clothes torn and eyes swollen from crying. And after them, others. Word spread without anyone meaning it to. People whispered that if a child had nowhere else to go, they should head west past the old mill, toward the cabin with the wide front porch, and the man who didn't ask many questions, but always opened the door. They called it Grace Haven, though no one could remember who said the name first. The little house grew. Extra rooms were built one winter, walls slapped together with uneven boards and stubborn hands. A school bell was hung from an old oak branch out front. The garden doubled in size. Chickens came back to the coop. Laughter returned to the air. Elias worked from sunup to sundown, hauling water, chopping wood, mending roofs, wiping tears, scolding muddy boots, and sitting up late with children who woke screaming from nightmares they couldn't explain. His hands stayed rough, but his voice softened. At night, he'd sit on the porch with Clara curled up beside him, her head resting against his arm, both of them listening to the crickets and watching fireflies blink across the tall grass. The years wore on. His hair turned silver. His steps slowed. One crisp spring morning, Clara found him sitting in his chair by the window, a book resting open on his lap, glasses tilted down his nose. The coffee on the table had gone cold. Elias Mercer had slipped away the way he lived, quiet, steady, without complaint. The town gathered for him. People who'd never spoken much to him in the early days now stood shoulder to shoulder near the oak tree out front. Children, his children, each in their own way, lined the porch steps in their Sunday clothes, holding wildflowers they'd picked themselves. The preacher said kind words. The sheriff stood off to the side, hat in hand, eyes low. Tom Larkin came too, sober and dressed in a clean shirt for the first time in years. But it was Clara, grown now, her voice steady and clear, who stood at the front and told them all about the man who had saved her with nothing more than a promise and a worn-out shotgun. When the last words were spoken and the crowd drifted away, Clara stayed behind. She sat in Elias's old chair, looking out over the field where new children played, their laughter rising with the morning air. Grace Haven lived on, and so did he. The girl stood at the gate with her small hands clenched tight around the straps of a canvas satchel. She wore a faded dress 2 sizes too big, and her shoes had holes at the toes. Dark hair fell in messy strands across her face. Her eyes stayed locked on the ground like she didn't dare look up, like the act of hoping for anything better might break her. Clara watched from the porch. It had been years since she'd stood where that girl now stood. Years since she'd gripped that same fence, heart pounding, wondering if anyone on the other side would care enough to answer. Clara rose from Elias's chair, still worn smooth at the arms, and made her way across the yard. The children playing in the field paused, glancing toward the gate. A few of the older boys lowered their voices, watching with quiet understanding. They'd all arrived the same way, alone, unsure, scared. Clara stopped just inside the gate, kneeling so she could meet the girl at eye level. The child's name was Emma, about 8 years old, sent here from 3 counties over. No family, no explanation beyond a short note pinned to her coat that read, "Please help her." Clara waited a moment before speaking. She didn't rush it, didn't force the girl to look up. She knew better. Instead, she rested a gentle hand on the wooden post beside them and let the silence fill the space between them. "I used to stand right here too," Clara said finally, her voice soft but steady, "holding my breath, wondering if I'd be turned away." Emma shifted just enough for Clara to catch a glimpse of her face, pale, streaked with dried tears. "You don't have to pretend you're brave," Clara whispered. "Not here." The girl's shoulders trembled. One shaky breath, then another. Clara reached out a hand, open, patient, offering but not demanding. For a long second, Emma stayed frozen. Then, slowly, she reached back. Her fingers slipped into Clara's like a fragile promise being made for the first time. Together, they walked toward the house, past the garden, past the oak tree where the school bell hung, past the porch steps worn smooth by years of restless feet. The other children watched from a distance but didn't crowd her. They'd all been there once too. At the front door, Clara paused, looked back at the wide field, the sun stretching low across the grass, painting everything gold. Somewhere deep inside, she thought of Elias, thought of that first day, the fence, the lie that became a truth. And before stepping inside, Clara leaned down one last time, her voice carrying just above a whisper. "You don't have to pretend," she said, her smile soft and full of memory. "You're already family." That night, after the children had eaten and the lamps were dimmed, Clara sat alone on the porch with a blanket pulled over her knees. The air held the cool bite of early spring, but she didn't mind. From the porch, she could see the full stretch of Grace Haven, the rows of vegetable beds waiting for planting, the chicken coop where new hens had started to settle, the oak tree, standing tall, its branches reaching like open arms. She listened to the soft rustle of sleeping children inside the house, muffled laughter from those still whispering past bedtime, a creak from the upstairs floorboards where someone shifted in their sleep. Everything felt full in a way she couldn't explain. Clara tilted her head back, looking at the stars. For years she used to wonder why Elias had chosen to help her that day. A stranger, a burden, a little girl asking too much. But now, she understood. Some choices aren't planned. Some promises aren't spoken. Some families aren't born. They're built, one small act at a time. Her eyes drifted toward the chair beside her, the one that still sat empty, right where Elias had left it. Sometimes, late at night, she swore she could still feel his presence there, the quiet weight of him, the steady comfort, the way he'd sit with her through long silences without needing to fill them. She smiled at the thought. Inside the house, Emma's soft footsteps creaked on the stairs. A few minutes later, the front door opened just wide enough for the little girl to slip through. Emma padded across the porch, blanket trailing behind her, and climbed onto Clara's lap without asking. Clara wrapped her arms around her, resting her chin on the top of Emma's head. They sat like that for a while, just breathing, just being. In the distance, a coyote called out, a lonely sound swallowed quickly by the night. Clara closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like that sound belonged to her. She wasn't the lonely girl at the fence anymore. She wasn't the frightened child hiding in a cellar. She was the woman who stayed, the one who opened the door, the one who said yes when it mattered. And somewhere in that quiet, she hoped Elias knew. that the life he saved had grown into something bigger than either of them could have imagined. As the night deepened and the air grew colder, Clara pulled the blanket tighter around them both, kissed the top of Emma's head, and whispered soft into the dark, "We're all right now." And with that, the porch light flickered, the crickets sang, and Grace Haven settled into sleep.